Before we begin, welcome. Today, I invite you to step back in time into a world of stone, sweat, and silence, a world where castles didn't just rise from the earth, they were carved out of human lives. We admire their beauty today, the tall towers, the iron gates, the majestic walls, but few ever stop to ask the most important question: how were they built, and what did it cost? Because behind every fortress is a hidden story. A story of men who worked in deadly cold, blistering heat, and brutal danger. A story of hands that bled, backs that broke, and voices history chose to ignore. We know the names of kings who owned the castles, but not the names of the laborers who built them. So in this video, we peel back the stone. We reveal the truth most textbooks never tell: how medieval workers actually built castles, and why the reality is far worse than you think. Let's begin. Castles have always captured the human imagination. When we picture them, we imagine towering stone walls rising against the sky, banners waving in the wind, knights standing guard, and kings sitting proudly on their thrones. We imagine royalty, feasts, shining armor, and epic battles. Even today, hundreds of years later, tourists walk through castle halls, run their hands across the cold stone, and say, how beautiful, how majestic. But beauty has a price. Today, those castle walls look smooth, strong, and timeless. Yet, behind every stone, there is a story, one that history rarely tells. Castles did not rise out of the ground like magic. They were not built with glory. They were not built with celebration. They were built with sweat. They were built with hunger. They were built with broken bones, torn muscles, and lives that ended long before they should have. Because every time you admire a giant fortress, what you really see is the result of thousands of ordinary people suffering in silence. If you lived in medieval Europe and someone told you that a new castle was being built, you wouldn't cheer. You wouldn't get excited about the architecture. You wouldn't think about beauty or history or power. You would think of work, back-breaking, soul-crushing work. You would think of long days, dangerous tools, brutal overseers, and the constant fear that one bad moment could take your life. When we talk about castles today, we talk about kings. We talk about queens. We talk about knights and lords and noble families who lived in stone walls protected from the world. But we never talk about the people who made those walls real. The people who didn't wear armor or silk or crowns. The people who wore rags, carried tools on their shoulders, and worked until their bodies broke. The people whose names were never written in books or carved on monuments. The people history forgot. Most castles took decades to finish. Some took lifetimes. Generations were born, worked, and died, while the same walls continued rising stone by stone. And every stone meant another day of labor for someone who never had a choice. Workers did not build castles because they wanted to. They built them because they had to, because the Lord demanded it, because taxes were owed, because hunger forced them into labor, because refusal meant punishment or starvation. So when we see a castle today, rising proudly over a valley or sitting on top of a hill, we see strength. We see power. We see something built to last forever. But the truth is darker. A castle is not just a fortress. It is a graveyard, not with tombstones and coffins, but with invisible memories of countless people who paid with their lives. And here's the cruelest part. History gave them nothing back. No reward, no honor, no stories, no statues. Their sacrifice became invisible, buried beneath the stones they lifted. Imagine the beginning of a castle's construction. A king or lord announces that a new fortress will be built. Trumpets may sound, priests may pray, and nobles may celebrate. Plans are drawn, money is collected, land is chosen, and then the orders are given. Workers are summoned, peasants are forced to participate, villages lose their men, and the project begins not with ceremony, but with suffering. First comes the clearing of land. Forests are cut down with axes. Hills are flattened, rivers are redirected, men push giant trees with ropes, chop through roots, and drag the trunks away. No machines, no iron vehicles, just manpower. Blisters cut open their hands. Splinters bury themselves under their nails. Exhaustion begins before the castle even exists. Then, stone must be quarried, not stones the size of your hand, massive blocks, heavy enough to crush a person in an instant. Men swing hammers as big as their heads. Iron wedges are hammered between cracks. Dust fills the air, filling their lungs with powder that chokes their breath. When a block finally breaks free, it must be moved. And that's where the real suffering begins. Workers tie ropes around the stone. They push, they pull, they strain. The sound of cracking joints fills the air. If someone slips, the stone does not stop. It rolls, it crushes, it kills, and the work does not pause. There is no moment of silence, no funeral, no mourning. The body is dragged away, and new workers are pulled in to replace him. The stones travel for miles. Villagers watch long lines of men dragging the blocks through fields, through mud, through snow, through blistering summer heat. Horses help where they can, but horses are expensive. Humans are not. If a horse gets injured, it is rested. If a worker gets injured, he is beaten, replaced, or left to die. At the construction site, scaffolding is raised. Thin wooden platforms stacked high against walls that reach taller every year. Workers climb with stones strapped to their backs or carried in their arms. A single mistake, a loose board, a slippery rope, a moment of dizziness, and a man falls to his death. No ropes to catch him, no nets, no protection, just a scream, a crash, and silence. And every day, hundreds of men risk this death because they have no choice. We look at castles today and say how strong they are, yet the people who built them were anything but strong by the time their work was done. Their strength was stolen by hunger, by exhaustion, by a life where rest was a luxury they could never afford. Some were paid a penny a day, just enough for stale bread and thin soup. Many worked not for money but to avoid punishment from their lords. And the cruelest irony, the very walls they built were not for their protection. Castles were not meant for the workers. Castles were meant to control them, to intimidate them, to remind them that the king was powerful and they were nothing. If an enemy invaded, workers would not get to hide inside those walls. They would be left outside to die, while the nobles stayed safe behind the stones that peasants' hands had lifted. Imagine building a fortress with your blood, only to die outside of it later. This is the part of history that most books skip, because it is easier to admire stone than to remember the bones buried beneath it. Every time we see a castle in a photograph, in a movie, or standing proudly on a hill, we are looking at the silent result of human suffering. Walls that took decades of labor, towers that swallowed generations of lives, gates that closed on the workers who built them. Kings took the credit, nobles celebrated the architecture, builders were forgotten. Think of the popular stories told about castles, heroic knights, brave kings, glorious battles. But the real story is not in the throne room. The real story is in the dirt, in the mud, in the blood spilled on wooden scaffolding, in the hands of men who worked until their fingers cracked open and bled. When tourists walk through castles today, they admire the stone carvings and the grand halls. They take pictures of the towers and the gates. But the workers who built those stones never stepped inside those halls. They never attended feasts. They never slept in soft beds. They built a world they would never get to live in, and that is the heartbreaking truth. Castles are symbols of power because they were built on the backs of people who had none. So when you look at a castle, whether in real life, in a photo, or in a book, try to see beyond the stone. Try to see the silent army of forgotten workers who lifted those walls. Try to imagine the hands that carried the rock, the backs that bent under weight, the legs that shook climbing unstable wood, the stomachs that starved, the families that waited for fathers who never came home. Their names are gone, their stories erased, but their work still stands, and that is why the story of how castles were built is not a tale of glory. It is a tale of sacrifice, a tale history tried to hide behind beauty, a tale carved into every stone, waiting for someone to tell it, because castles may be majestic, but the truth behind them is far worse than anyone imagines. Kings ordered castles to be built, but kings never lifted the stones. Knights protected the walls, but knights never raised them. The true builders of medieval castles were the people history almost never speaks of, not nobles in shining armor, but the forgotten, the poor, and the desperate. When a king announced a new castle, it wasn't a celebration for ordinary people. It was a sentence, because someone had to build it, and that someone was usually everyone who had no power to refuse. In the medieval world, most people were peasants. They worked the land owned by a lord. They paid taxes in crops, labor, or coin they rarely had. When a castle needed to be built, their lives changed overnight. Women, children, elderly, prisoners, and strong men were all dragged into the labor force. Some were hired, some volunteered out of starvation, many were forced, and none of them had a choice. Most of these workers woke up before sunrise. Their days started long before the roosters crowed. A thin meal of stale bread, maybe onions or watery porridge if they were lucky, and then it was time to walk to the site. In summer, the heat burned their skin and dried their throats. In winter, cold wind sliced through their clothing until their fingers turned numb. But weather didn't matter. Work went on every day. If the stones weren't moving, someone was being punished. The workers were not heroes in shining armor. They wore torn wool shirts, rough trousers, leather boots that were barely shoes at all. Their clothes were full of holes, shoulders worn down from carrying ropes, backs damp with sweat and dust. Most owned nothing but the ragged clothing on their bodies. They came to the site with empty stomachs and left with broken bones, cracked skin, and the hope that tomorrow they might survive another day. Some workers were masons, skilled men who shaped stone with hammers and chisels. They were the architects of the walls, the ones who turned raw stone into perfect blocks. Their work required skill and precision, but that didn't make it safe. A single slip of a tool could send a chunk of stone flying into someone's skull. A miscalculated cut could make an entire wall collapse, and when a mason made a mistake, the punishment was not a scolding. It could be a beating, a fine, or being thrown off the site entirely, because kings had no patience for delay. Time was money, and workers were replaceable. Carpenters built scaffolding, cranes, towers, gates, bridges, and the wooden frames that supported heavy stones. They worked high above the ground using saws, mallets, ropes, and chisels. One loose plank, one rotten beam, one unstable platform, and they could fall from heights that meant instant death. Many did. Nobody wrote down their names. Nobody carved their graves. Their bodies were taken away, and the work continued. Blacksmiths were essential, yet invisible. They forged tools, hammers, chisels, nails, bolts, iron pins, wheel bands, and chains. Without them, nothing could be built. Their forges burned day and night. Sparks scorched their skin, smoke filled their lungs, and molten metal splashed like fire. Their muscles shook from hammering iron all day. Their ears rang constantly from the sound of metal striking metal. Their reward was barely enough coin to keep their families from hunger. Then came the laborers, the lowest of the low. They were peasants, farmers who lost their land, beggars who needed food, or men taken by force. Some were criminals working for freedom. Others were soldiers who lost favor. And many were simply villagers who were told they had no choice. Their job was simple: carry, drag, lift, shovel, and push. There was no skill required, only strength, strength that broke slowly, day after day. Laborers hauled stones with ropes that cut into their hands until they bled. They pushed wooden carts filled with rocks heavier than their bodies. They dug foundations with crude shovels, carved trenches with bare hands, and carried buckets of mortar up tall, swaying scaffolds. Their backs bent under unbearable loads, their knees trembled, and their feet sank into mud that never seemed to dry. If they got tired, they were beaten. If they got injured, they were replaced. If they died, no one stopped working. Some workers were prisoners, men captured in war, criminals condemned by the law, or rebels who challenged the king. They worked chained together, pulling stones like imprisoned oxen. Their guards carried whips and swords, and any sign of weakness could mean a blow to the back or the head. For prisoners, building a castle was not a job. It was a slow execution. But the saddest workers of all were the villagers who came only because they had nothing else. A bad harvest, a sickness, a flood, or a cruel tax could destroy a family's life. When famine struck, building a castle was sometimes the only way to survive. Peasants would walk miles carrying their starving children, desperate for work. They slept on the ground, worked until exhaustion, and prayed to God they wouldn't die before earning a few coins. Women often worked too, hauling water, carrying stones, mixing mortar, preparing food for thousands of workers. Some historians ignore this, but women suffered alongside men. Children, too, ran errands, fetched tools, carried buckets of lime, and worked ropes for lifting cranes. Childhood did not exist for the poor. You worked or you starved. There were no holidays, no weekends, no breaks. Work began at sunrise and ended when darkness made it impossible to see. Even then, some workers stayed to repair tools or prepare the next day's materials. They ate a small meal and collapsed where they stood. Many slept in mud, in huts made of sticks, or under scraps of cloth. Rats crawled across their bodies at night. Wolves howled in the distance. Disease followed them everywhere. Fevers, coughs, infections. Death was never far away, and still they worked, not because they loved the job, not because they cared about the king, but because life in the medieval world left no other options. A peasant had two choices: obey, or suffer worse consequences. Some workers were paid in coins, but the pay was so small that a laborer might earn less in a week than a noble spent on a single meal. Others were paid in food: bread, beer, soup, maybe meat once in a while. But even that was little. Most workers stayed hungry. Some collapsed from hunger. Some fainted on the scaffolding and fell to their deaths. Hunger was as deadly as accidents. It is easy to imagine that skilled workers had better lives, but the difference was small. Stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths were respected for their skills, yet they too were treated as tools, valuable tools, but tools nonetheless. Their bodies were pushed to the limits. Their injuries were ignored. Their lives were not protected, and here is something most people never realize. The workers who built castles were often forced to build them for their own rulers, the same rulers who taxed them, punished them, and took their food. A castle was not a gift to the people. It was a symbol of control, a warning, a display of power. If the peasants ever rebelled, those walls would protect the lord, not the people. If invaders came, nobles would hide inside the castle while the peasants were left outside to die. So imagine the cruelty of building something you would never be allowed to enter. Imagine shaping stones that would eventually form walls you would never touch. Imagine lifting beams to build chambers you would never sleep in. Imagine knowing that the fortress you spent your life constructing would protect everyone except you. Many workers understood this, but they had no voice to resist. The Lord owned the land. The Lord owned their homes. The Lord owned their labor. Freedom was an illusion for the common man. Construction leaders, overseers, watched the workers like wolves watching sheep. They carried sticks, ropes, and whips. Their job was not to build the castle, but to force others to build it faster. If the work slowed, someone got punished. If a worker was weak, he was beaten until he continued. If a man died, another took his place. There was always another hungry peasant to fill the gap. Some overseers measured productivity by counting how many stones a team moved in a day. If the number was too low, the punishment was immediate. Anything that slowed progress was an offense. A worker who stopped to drink water, a man who rested his back, someone who missed a day because of illness. There was no mercy on the construction site, and yet, despite all the suffering, thousands continued to work, because life outside the castle walls was just as cruel. Poverty was everywhere. Disease was everywhere. Death was always near. Working on a castle was horrible, but starvation was worse. A man who could not provide for his family was considered useless, and his children would die long before adulthood. So even if the work was brutal, even if the pay was small, even if the danger was constant, people came anyway. There were moments, rare moments, when workers felt pride. Seeing a wall climb higher, a tower pierce the sky, or a gate finally stand in place could fill a worker with a quiet sense of accomplishment. But pride did not erase the pain. Pride did not heal broken bones or fill empty stomachs. Pride did not protect them from being forgotten, and forgotten they were. History remembers the kings who ordered the castles. It remembers the architects who designed them. It remembers the nobles who lived behind the walls. But the men and women who carried the stones, cut the wood, forged the iron, and mixed the mortar disappeared from the story. No one wrote down their names. No one honored their sacrifice. No one kept records of their lives. They were born in poverty, worked in misery, and died in silence. Their legacy was not written in books. It was built in walls. Every castle that still stands today is a monument not to kings, but to suffering. Behind every stone is a human story of someone who bent beneath its weight. Behind every tower is a man who risked his life to finish it. Behind every gate is a worker who never walked through it. The world admires castles as symbols of strength, but the real strength belonged to the workers who built them. Their hands shaped history. Their sweat mixed with mortar. Their blood stained the ground. Their lives were the price of stone, and yet the world forgot them. But when you look closely, when you stare at the rough stones, the uneven walls, the tool marks still visible after centuries, you can still see the hands of the men who lifted them. You can feel the weight of the stones they carried. You can hear the echoes of hammers, the shouts of overseers, the groans of workers struggling under impossible loads. Their bodies are gone, but their work still stands. Castles were not miracles. They were not wonders of engineering alone. They were the result of endless human suffering, work done by people who would never see glory, never gain reward, and never escape the life they were born into. That is the truth of who built medieval castles. Not kings, not knights, but ordinary people whose names history erased. Work on a medieval construction site was not simply difficult. It was relentless, exhausting, and terrifying. Every single day was a battle between the human body and the impossible demands placed upon it. The workers who built castles did not just labor. They lived in a world where every swing of a hammer, every lift of a stone, every pull of a rope brought them one step closer to collapse or death. When dawn came, the work began. The sun had barely lifted itself over the horizon before men were already at the quarry, hammering stone out of the earth. The sound of iron tools striking limestone echoed through the fields for miles. The ground shook with each blow, and clouds of dust rose into the air until every breath felt like swallowing sand. The tools were heavy, and the men who swung them were exhausted before the day even started. But the overseers demanded speed. There was no time for rest. A castle wall needed to rise, and the king would not wait. Breaking stone was only the first step. Once the huge blocks were cut from the earth, they had to be shaped perfectly. Masons used hammers, chisels, and iron wedges to split the rock into even slabs. Each block had to fit with the next, because a crooked stone could weaken an entire wall. One slip could ruin days of work. One mistake could bring down a tower that had taken years to build. The pressure was enormous, and the margin for error was almost zero. When the blocks were ready, they needed to be moved, and this was where the true suffering began. There were no machines, no engines, no metal cranes powered by gears, just human muscle and primitive wooden tools. Workers tied ropes around the massive stones, thick ropes often soaked in sweat and mud. Dozens of men would pull together, legs shaking, backs bending, veins bulging in their arms. The stones scraped across the ground, digging trenches in the dirt. Every inch forward was a victory. Every foot gained was paid for with pain. The roads were rough. Mud swallowed boots. Rocks tore skin. The weight of the stones pulled men forward until their shoulders nearly dislocated. Men slipped, fell, got dragged, cried out, and still had to stand up and continue. If a stone rolled in the wrong direction, it could crush a man instantly. If a rope snapped, it could whip back with force strong enough to slice flesh. And if the workers moved too slowly, the overseers shouted, threatened, and sometimes beat them. There were no special protections for injuries. A twisted ankle, a broken finger, a crushed hand. None of it mattered. If a man could walk, he was expected to work. And if he couldn't walk, he often starved. Because if you weren't useful, you weren't fed. After dragging the stones across land, they had to be lifted into place. Castles rose high. Walls that stood taller than trees, towers that pierced the sky. To build them, workers constructed scaffolding, but scaffolding in the medieval world was dangerously unstable. Wooden planks were lashed together with rope. Nails were scarce. Many platforms wobbled with every step. Climbing them while carrying heavy stones was like walking on a shaking bridge, high above the ground, with death waiting below. Imagine a worker standing 50 feet in the air, on a plank only a hand's width thick, holding a stone heavier than his own body. The wind pushes against him. The plank shakes under his feet. Sweat drips into his eyes, blinding him. His arms tremble as the weight cuts into his shoulders. One wrong step, one slip of the foot, and he falls. There is no net, no harness, no one to catch him. And if he falls, he doesn't just break bones. He dies, because hitting the dirt from that height shatters the body like glass. Men fell often. Sometimes the scaffolding collapsed entirely. Ropes snapped, pulleys failed, stones dropped from above, hitting workers below. When that happened, there were no doctors, no surgeons, no hospitals. Most injured men were simply carried away, left to die on makeshift beds of straw. Their families mourned quietly, and the work continued. The castle was more important than their lives. Lime was used to make mortar, and lime burns the skin. Workers mixed lime with water in wooden troughs, using bare hands and wooden paddles. When the wind blew the powder, it entered their eyes, causing blindness. It entered their lungs, causing coughing fits that lasted for days. The mortar they carried up the scaffolding burned through clothes and into flesh. Many workers had permanent scars from lime burns. Some lost their eyesight entirely and were forced to beg for food for the rest of their lives. Water was another danger. To build moats and foundations, workers had to dig deep trenches, often below water level. These pits filled with dirty, stagnant water. Mud sucked men down like quicks, and if a wall collapsed into the trench, workers were buried alive. Many drowned in the mud, suffocated under soil, or were crushed by collapsing earth. Their bodies were sometimes never recovered. The castle simply rose above their graves, and when workers weren't dealing with stone or mud, they faced the weight of timber. Logs were huge and heavy, cut from forests miles away. Workers dragged them across land by hand, straining against the wood as it tore through dirt and grass. They built cranes made of timber, simple devices with ropes and pulleys that lifted stones into the air. These cranes were not reliable. The ropes could snap, the beams could break. When they did, the falling stone was like a weapon, crushing anyone underneath. Accidents were not rare, they were constant. Fingers lost under wheels, feet crushed under stones, men impaled by broken tools, hands smashed by hammers, bones shattered from falls, bodies sliced open by sharp stone edges. And because painkillers did not exist, every injury was agony. The best medicine available was a cloth soaked in wine or ale, and that was only if anyone cared enough to offer it. But the worst part of all was the exhaustion. Castle work was not a job, it was punishment. From sunrise to sundown, workers lifted, pulled, dragged, hammered, and dug. Their muscles burned, their joints cracked, their backs bent until they could barely stand straight. The body of a medieval worker aged 3 times faster than a noble's. By the age of 30, a laborer looked 50. By 40, he looked like an old man. Many never lived that long. Sweat mixed with dust until their skin felt like sandpaper. Their clothes stuck to their bodies, soaked through with mud, blood, and mortar. Their skin blistered, their feet swelled, their hands became nothing but calluses and scars. When it rained, they worked in mud so deep it swallowed their ankles. When it snowed, their fingers went numb until the tools slipped from their hands. When the sun was hot, the stones became scorching to the touch, burning skin. They had no gloves, no helmets, no shoes padded with leather or iron. Their bodies were the only shields they had. The sounds of work filled the air every day. Hammers striking stone, saws cutting wood, carts rattling over earth, men shouting to each other, overseers barking orders, and sometimes the screams, quick, sharp, and cut short, when someone fell, or when stone hit flesh, or when a rope snapped. No one stopped to mourn, no one prayed, no one paused. The body was dragged away, and the gap he left in the workforce was filled before nightfall. Even strong men broke down under the strain. The strongest workers often died the fastest because they were pushed the hardest. If a man showed strength, the overseers loaded him with more work. If he lifted one stone easily, they made him lift 2. Strength was not rewarded, it was exploited, and there was always fear, fear of falling, fear of being crushed, fear of punishment, fear of losing a hand or breaking a leg, fear of hunger, fear of death. The workers lived in fear every hour of every day, knowing that a single mistake could end everything. Yet despite all this brutality, castles continued to rise, stone by stone, layer by layer, year after year, because the suffering of one man meant nothing to the king. 10 deaths meant nothing. 100 deaths meant nothing. The castle had to stand, and human lives were just part of the cost. Some men sang while they worked, not because they were happy, but to forget the pain. Some prayed. Some cursed the lords who forced them into labor. Some worked silently, knowing there was no escape. A man who fled would be hunted. A man who resisted would be beaten. A man who rebelled would be executed. Men died building castles. Some were buried under the walls they raised. Some drowned in the moats they dug. Some fell from towers they never saw finished. Their ghosts, if ghosts exist, were trapped in the stones forever. Generations worked on a single castle. A father might spend his entire life building the lower walls, and his son would return years later to build the towers. The castle outlived them both. That was the cruel truth. Workers built something they would never enjoy, for a king who saw them as disposable. And yet the world remembers only the beauty of the walls, the strength of the towers, the brilliance of the architecture. We marvel at the craftsmanship, but we forget the suffering it required. Most people never think about the men who hauled the stones until their backs broke. They never think about the men who fell to their deaths, whose bones are still buried beneath the earth. They never think about the pain that built every inch of those walls. Castles did not rise because of genius alone. They rose because thousands of workers sacrificed their bodies and their lives. The work was slow, dangerous, and horrifying, but it created something meant to last forever, and it did. Centuries have passed. The workers are gone, their names are forgotten, but the stones they lifted still stand. The towers they built still scrape the sky. The walls they bled for still draw tourists who admire their beauty without knowing their cost. Every castle is a monument to suffering, not the suffering of kings or knights, but of ordinary men, poor, voiceless, nameless, who gave everything and received nothing. Their pain is carved into the stone. Their sweat hardened in the mortar, their blood seeped into the foundations, and though history erased their names, the walls remain, silent witnesses to the brutality that built them. As the castle walls rose higher, the world around the workers grew smaller. The labor that once covered open ground now climbed into the air. The risk of falling became a daily companion, like a shadow that never left. Every step taken on the scaffolding was a gamble with death. Wooden planks creaked beneath their feet. Ropes strained under the weight of stones. Workers moved slowly, carefully, but even the most experienced builder could not control the wind, the wood, or simple bad luck. At ground level, a mistake might break a bone. At the top of a 50-foot wall, a mistake could erase a life. There were no safety harnesses, no protective railings. The people building castles were not protected by laws, because in the medieval world, laborers were not considered valuable enough to protect. If one worker fell and shattered his body on the stone below, the Lord did not stop construction to investigate. No record was written, no family was compensated. Another man would simply be ordered to climb the same height and continue the same work. The scaffolding itself was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was crude, improvised, and constantly shifting. Rough wooden beams were tied together with rope or wedged into holes in the stone, and every day the workers trusted their lives to this wooden skeleton. Imagine a stonemason standing on a platform that swayed as the wind pushed against it. He holds a hammer in one hand, a chisel in the other, carving stone that weighs more than he does. The platform moves again. Dust falls into his eyes, his hands ache. He cannot wipe sweat from his face because if he lets go of his tools, he might lose his balance. One wrong movement, one moment of distraction, and he would fall. The other workers below would only hear a scream and then the sound of impact, like a sack of meat hitting the ground, and the work would go on. The higher the walls grew, the more dangerous the job became. When the first few meters were built, the fall could injure someone, maybe even kill them. But by the time the walls reached the height of trees, then buildings, and then church towers, a fall meant instant death. Workers who survived the initial impact often died later from infection or broken bones that medieval medicine could not heal. The construction of a castle was as lethal as warfare, and yet the world treated it as ordinary labor. Even the ropes they used were a threat. Medieval ropes were made of hemp or animal fibers and weakened under rain, cold, and heat. They frayed, they snapped. Workers tied heavy stones to them, trusting the rope to hold, but ropes did not always obey. When a rope broke, the block it carried would plummet. Sometimes it landed on the ground, smashing into pieces. Sometimes it landed on a worker. There were stories whispered among building crews, stories of men who were crushed so badly their bodies were unrecognizable, flattened by the very stone they had tried to place. Other stories told of workers who were knocked from platforms by swinging blocks. Their bodies fell like dolls from the sky, arms flailing, faces frozen in terror. Onlookers below could do nothing. They would step back, make space, and wait for the body to hit the ground, and then they continued working. The pace of construction did not slow for fear or death, because the nobility demanded progress. Lords wanted their castles finished within their lifetime. Kings wanted their fortresses to show strength, to intimidate rivals, and to prepare for war. Every delay meant excuses, and excuses were not acceptable. So foremen pushed harder, yelling at workers who hesitated, striking men who moved too slowly, forcing them to climb higher and lift heavier loads. The brutality of this work environment was not accidental, it was expected. Workers knew that complaining about danger could mean punishment. Refusing to climb scaffolding could mean being replaced, and being replaced meant starvation. In a world where wages were low and jobs were scarce, a laborer had little power. He worked because he needed bread for his family. He worked because winter was coming. He worked because hunger was a sharper threat than fear. Even the weather tortured them. Rain turned scaffolding into a slick, trembling trap. Wind tore at clothing and made stones swing unpredictably. Frost made planks brittle and slippery. Summer heat burned their backs and weakened their muscles. There was no weather delay. There were no days off because it snowed or stormed. If the Lord wanted the work done, it was done. If the weather was dangerous, workers were expected to continue anyway, because nature was not an excuse. And all the while the castle grew taller, but height was not the only danger. Sometimes the greatest threat came from below. Beneath the castle, deep trenches were dug for foundations. Workers climbed into these pits, surrounded by walls of dirt that could collapse at any moment. When the soil was unstable, one wrong strike of a shovel could trigger a landslide. Men were buried in seconds, swallowed by earth, their cries muffled by dirt. Other workers dug frantically to reach them, but by the time they uncovered the bodies, it was too late. Breathing under tons of soil was impossible. Some workers suffocated beneath the very foundations they built. They became part of the castle in the most literal way. There were also tunnels and latrines to dig narrow passages with little air, where workers crawled like animals underground. They carried torches to light the darkness, but torches consumed oxygen. Many collapsed from lack of air. Some passed out and never woke. Others caught fire when their clothes brushed against the flame. The underground work was suffocating, filthy, and deadly, but one danger was feared above all others: the collapse of unfinished walls. A castle wall under construction was unstable. The stones had not yet settled. Mortar was still soft, and if the base had even the slightest weakness, the entire structure could fall like a house of cards. Witnesses described walls suddenly cracking with a sound like thunder. Workers screamed and ran. Some were too slow. The stones tumbled down, crushing bodies and burying men alive. A single collapse could kill dozens. Sometimes walls fell because there were too few skilled builders. Sometimes they fell because the Lord rushed the work. Sometimes they fell because the earth beneath the castle shifted. But no matter the reason, the workers paid the price. While the Lord demanded they rebuild, there were no investigations, no inspections, no safety rules. The medieval world accepted death as part of construction, just as it accepted death in war or childbirth or disease. Life was cheap, labor was cheaper. The danger, however, did not end with construction accidents. Even when a worker survived long enough to become skilled, the job slowly destroyed his body. Constant lifting damaged the spine. Repeated hammering deformed fingers and joints. Dust from sandstone and lime filled their lungs, leading to slow, painful suffocation as their bodies weakened over time. Many workers died with lungs full of stone powder, coughing blood, unable to breathe, dying younger than they should have. And yet, every morning they returned to work, not because they were brave, but because they had no choice. A man with a family had to earn money. A man without a family had to survive on his own. Life offered no escape. No worker dreamed of glory. They dreamed of bread. They dreamed of a night without pain. They dreamed of living long enough to see the end of winter. If they were lucky, They had one day off a week, the Sabbath. But even on days of rest, many worked on side tasks to feed their families. Rest was a luxury only the rich understood. The church preached faith and endurance, telling workers that God rewarded suffering. But even faith could not protect them from falling stones or collapsing scaffolds. Some prayed before every climb. Some kissed crosses hanging from their necks. Some whispered final words to the wind before stepping onto planks that might become their grave. And what about women and children? They were there too. Women hauled water, carried stones, cooked for workers, and transported mortar in baskets strapped to their backs. Children fetched tools, collected firewood, and worked as apprentices. A child could not carry a block of stone, but he could climb narrow scaffolding with buckets or hammer nails into beams. Children learned the dangers early. Some grew up watching fathers die. Some grew up expecting they would die the same way. The construction of a castle did not spare the young. It consumed entire families, and still the towers rose. To anyone watching from a distance, a castle under construction looked impressive, a symbol of power and ambition. But to those standing inside the construction site, it was a battlefield of exhaustion. The sound of hammers never stopped. The grinding of stone echoed across the valley. Dust filled the air, coating lungs and eyes. The ground shook when large stones dropped into place. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and wet mortar. At night, the site fell silent, but silence did not mean peace. Workers returned to small huts or shared rooms filled with straw. Their bodies screamed with pain, their hands throbbed, their backs burned. Many slept in mud or on bare earth, too poor to afford comfort. Wounds went untreated, infections spread, some never woke again. In the morning, the foreman's whistle or shout pulled them back to labor. The castle did not care who lived or died. The Lord did not care. Even history did not care. Yet somehow, despite all this suffering, castles were built. Walls rose higher, towers reached the sky, gatehouses took shape, drawbridges were carved and assembled. Stone by stone, bone by bone, life by life, a monument of power grew. When it was finally finished, the Lord walked proudly through his new fortress. Priests blessed it, nobles feasted, wine flowed, songs were sung about the greatness of the king or lord who built such magnificence. But the people who did the actual building were not invited to the banquet. They were not thanked, they were not honored. Many of them were already dead, buried in unmarked graves or forgotten in the fields. Those who survived simply moved on to the next job, the next lord, the next wall to build. Because castles were always needed, and there was always another generation of men desperate enough to build them. And that is the brutal truth. Every castle that stands today, every beautiful fortress admired by tourists, photographed for history books, and praised for its craftsmanship, was a machine that ate human lives. The stones did not rise through glory, they rose through pain. Every window, every arch, every tower is a monument to suffering. The workers faced heights that terrified even the bravest men. They worked with tools that betrayed them. They balanced on wood that broke. They lifted stones that killed them. Some vanished under rubble. Some fell from scaffolds. Some died slowly from the dust they breathed. Others survived, but with damaged bodies and shortened lives. Castles have lasted for centuries. The workers did not. When people admire them today, they rarely think of the men who died building them, the families who lost fathers and sons, the lives cut short so a king could sleep safely behind stone walls. Yet the stones remember, the castle remembers. It stands as a silent witness to the suffering buried beneath it. And that is the story history never wanted to tell. The further a castle project advanced, the more its hunger grew. Stone alone was not enough. A castle was not simply a pile of rocks. It was a machine of war, a puzzle of architecture, and a living fortress. to make it stand, the builders needed more than strength. They needed knowledge, they needed structure, they needed organization, and the medieval world did not organize gently. The entire construction site became a strict hierarchy, one that decided who commanded, who obeyed, and who suffered the worst. At the very top were the nobility, the king, the lord, or the powerful churchman whose authority gave birth to the towering fortress. They came to the site rarely. When they did, it was not to work. It was to look, to judge, to demand faster progress. Below them were the master masons and architects, the true brains behind the castle. They were the elite craftsmen of the medieval world. Their knowledge of geometry, weight distribution, arch construction, and stone shaping made them valuable. They could read designs, draw blueprints, and understand how to make walls stand for hundreds of years. But their intelligence did not protect the workers below them. It only made the work continue. Master masons shouted orders, pointed fingers, and demanded perfection. They did not tolerate mistakes. A stone cut badly was thrown away. A wall laid uneven had to be torn down and rebuilt. Workers who moved too slowly were removed or beaten. Precision mattered because one flaw could bring down an entire structure. And so the master mason enforced discipline not with kindness, but with fear. Beneath the master mason stood the skilled workers, stonecutters, carpenters, and blacksmiths. Stonecutters spent their days splitting massive blocks into clean shapes. Their hammers rang across valleys like thunder. They shaved corners, carved angles, and prepared stones to fit perfectly like pieces of a giant puzzle. They were respected, but respect did not save their lungs. Clouds of dust surrounded them every hour of every day. The dust crawled down their throats, coating their chests, turning breath into pain. Many stonecutters died coughing, their lungs turning rigid, their bones buried before the castle was finished. Carpenters built scaffolding, hoists, supports, and rooftops. They worked with saws, axes, and hammers. Their job was dangerous and precise. If a scaffolding pole snapped, men died. If a beam was cut incorrectly, a platform collapsed. Carpenters lived with the knowledge that a mistake could kill not just one man but dozens, and yet they were paid barely enough to feed their children. The responsibility was enormous. The reward was small. Blacksmiths forged the tools, chisels, nails, hammers, hinges, metal reinforcements, and weapons for castle guards. They stood before blazing furnaces in unbearable heat, sweating buckets as sparks attacked their arms and faces. Burns scarred their skin permanently. Their ears went deaf from constant hammering, but the forge never rested because every broken tool meant lost time, and lost time meant punishment. And then came the lowest class, the unskilled laborers, the peasants, the poorest of the poor. These were the men who carried stones on their backs, dragged carts, mixed mortar, dug trenches, shoveled dirt, hauled timber, and obeyed every command without question. They did not need skill. They needed strength and obedience. They were paid the least, fed the worst, and beaten the hardest. Some were free men who chose this work because starvation was worse. Others were peasants forced into labor by the lord who owned their land. Many were so poor they had no shoes and worked barefoot on sharp stone and frozen ground. Some were criminals given labor instead of execution. Some were prisoners of war who toiled under the eyes of armed guards. A few were enslaved completely, treated like animals, and given nothing except the right to live another day. These men were the backbone of construction. Without them, no castle could ever rise, but their lives were considered disposable. If a laborer fell sick, no healer came. If he broke a bone, he was abandoned. If he died, his body was dragged away, and another starving man took his place. And yet, the work continued. The castle was more than walls. It was a complex system. Workers built guardhouses, storage halls, kitchens, chapels, living quarters, moats, wells, drawbridges, and towers. Every part required planning, materials, and thousands of hands. And behind everything stood one secret force: logistics. Imagine the endless supply chain that fed a castle's construction. Thousands of stones, tons of sand, barrels of lime, giant logs of timber, wagons of metal, and endless food for the workers. Carters drove oxen carts across rough terrain, hauling stone from quarries miles away. Farmers delivered grain to feed laborers. Boats carried heavy loads on rivers when roads failed. Every transport was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. Carters faced threats from thieves, wild animals, floods, and storms. Roads washed out, wheels snapped, horses died, some wagons toppled over cliffs, some sank in mud. If a load was delayed, workers stood idle. If workers stood idle, foremen exploded in anger. Punishments followed. Even water was a challenge. Castles needed wells, and digging a well could take years. Workers tunneled through rock, lowered by rope into blackness, swinging picks by the dim light of a torch. If the walls collapsed, the workers were entombed. If water flooded unexpectedly, they drowned. If air ran thin, they suffocated. And yet, they kept digging because the castle demanded water. The organization of all this labor was rigid and militaristic. Foremen patrolled the site. Overseers carried sticks or whips. Orders were screamed constantly over the clamor of stone and hammer. Workers were treated like herd animals. If they slowed, they were pushed. If they resisted, they were punished. If they failed, they were replaced. Once the outer walls were complete, a new wave of suffering began: the interior work. Enormous wooden beams had to be lifted into place to form floors, ceilings, and roofs. Workers used treadwheel cranes, massive wooden wheels that men walked inside like human hamsters, using their own body weight to lift enormous loads. It was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. A slip inside the wheel could crush a worker against the spokes. To build vaulted ceilings, workers erected forests of wooden supports, then carefully laid stones in curved shapes that defied gravity. If one support cracked or shifted, the ceiling collapsed, burying everyone beneath. And still, there were no safety rules, no protections, just hope and fear. Mortar had to be mixed endlessly, sand, lime, and water stirred by hand until it became the glue that held the castle together. Workers stood in pits, stomping the mixture with their feet like animals treading mud. The chemicals burned their skin, the fumes scarred their lungs. Many developed chronic rashes and open sores that never healed. Even finishing touches were dangerous. To carve decorations, sculptors dangled on ropes, chiseling designs high in the air. One slip meant death. To paint murals, artists climbed ladders that shook with every movement. To install stained glass windows, glaziers handled molten lead and sharp shards that sliced their hands to ribbons. And every step, every stone, every nail, every window was born from a worker's suffering. Years passed, then decades. Some castles took longer to build than the lifespan of a worker. A man might begin work at 16 and die of exhaustion by 40, having spent every day of his life on the same fortress. His son would take his place, maybe even his grandson. Generations died building what one lord would enjoy for a few years. There is a cruel irony in this. Castles were built to last forever. The workers who built them did not last at all. When the final stones were placed and the last scaffolding came down, the workers did not celebrate. There was no ceremony for them. Their job was simply over. Many were dismissed and sent back to villages with broken bodies and empty pockets. Some were immediately sent to build the next castle. A lucky few found permanent work as guards or maintenance workers inside the fortress, but these were rare exceptions. The Lord, however, celebrated. A feast was held. Nobles and clergy praised the construction. Songs were sung about the greatness of the ruler. The castle became a symbol of power, wealth, and divine right. Visitors admired the architecture. Travelers wrote about its strength. No one praised the workers. Most of their names were never recorded. Even the masons, who held the most skill, often left behind only a mason's mark, a small carved symbol on a stone, hidden in a wall, unnoticed by anyone who does not know where to look. That symbol was their signature, their silent voice across centuries, but the laborers didn't even have that. Their existence vanished, and yet something remains of them, something carved not in stone, but in the silence of their story. When tourists walk through a castle today, they take pictures, they admire the view, they marvel at the engineering. They speak of knights and kings, sieges and swords. They hardly ever think of the thousands of invisible lives that made the fortress possible. But the truth stands, just as the castle stands. Every stone was carried by hands that shook with fatigue. Every tower was paid for with lives. Every wall was lifted by men who died without reward. And if those workers could speak across time, what would they say? They would not talk of glory. They would not brag about architecture. They would not quote kings or nobles. They would speak of hunger, pain, cold, fear, and the weight of stones heavier than their hope. They would speak of nights where their bodies ached so badly they could not sleep. They would speak of friends who vanished under falling walls. They would speak of children who grew up fatherless. They would speak of a world that demanded everything and gave nothing. And yet their suffering created something eternal. Castles still stand. Stone outlives flesh. Walls last longer than bones. The builders are forgotten, but their work remains. There is a strange sadness in that. A strange beauty, too, because while history erased their names, it could not erase their legacy. Every step on a castle staircase, every echo in its halls, every ripple of shadow on its walls is a silent tribute to the people who gave everything to build it. Their story lives in the stones, even if the world has ignored it. And now, perhaps, the invisible workers are not so invisible anymore. The castle stands completed now, its stones rising like the ribs of some enormous creature petrified in time. Towers that once lived only as charcoal sketches on parchment now scrape the sky, casting shadows that stretch across villages, forests, and rivers. From a distance, it looks glorious, majestic, immovable, and eternal. But for the thousands of men who built it, the story didn't end when the scaffolding came down. In many ways, this was where the most overlooked part of their journey began. Because once the final stone was laid and the Lord declared his fortress ready, the world did not simply reward these workers with comfort, recognition, or prosperity. The truth is colder than the winds that swept through unfinished corridors. Once the labor was done, the workers were forgotten. Some walked away with coins, just enough to travel home, buy bread, or pay rent. Others were simply dismissed, sent off without gratitude or farewell. They had built walls that kings would someday boast about, but there were no parades for the men who carved the stones, bled into the mortar, or buried friends whose names history chose not to keep. Their footprints were erased by snow, by rain, by time. And yet the castle was not the end of suffering, because a brand new fortress demanded caretakers. It needed guards to stand at the gates, masons to repair chipping stone, carpenters to replace rotting beams, blacksmiths to sharpen weapons, and servants to clean chambers and haul water. For some, this was a blessing, steady work, shelter, and a predictable routine. But a castle was not a peaceful place, even when war was far away. Disease spread easily under vaulted ceilings. Fire could transform wooden interiors into death traps. Food shortages turned banquet halls silent, and when the lord rode out to war, the castle became a target, because stone walls attract enemies the way gold attracts thieves. The workers who stayed behind often discovered that the castle they built was not a sanctuary, but a burden. They remembered the days when the land was open, when they slept under the sky instead of inside cold stone rooms. The very walls that were meant to protect them felt like a cage. Freedom, once lost, was impossible to reclaim. Those who left to find work elsewhere discovered that every village, town, and kingdom was building something. Another fortress, another bridge, another cathedral reaching toward heaven. Some men spent their entire lives building monuments for people wealthier than they could imagine, yet they themselves died with nothing. A mason who carved delicate patterns into limestone might never own a bed carved half as fine. A carpenter who built elaborate wooden roofs might die in a hut with a roof that leaked. The imbalance was something everyone saw but no one questioned, because life in the Middle Ages was not fair. It was never meant to be. And then there were the soldiers, men who had watched the castle rise, but were never allowed to touch the stones. They trained in the courtyard, listening to the clang of hammers on iron. They watched carpenters raise drawbridges and blacksmiths forge blades. But the day the castle was finished, these soldiers walked into their own kind of nightmare. They were the ones expected to fight, bleed, kill, and die to defend the walls the workers had raised. Their lives were as expendable as arrows. Some never fired a single shot in battle. They simply stood in armor for years, waiting for an enemy who might never come. And when war did arrive, death rarely came with dignity, just chaos, terror, and screams bouncing off walls that suddenly didn't feel tall enough or strong enough. The story behind every medieval castle is a story of contradictions. People imagine glory, chivalry, shining armor, but the truth is that castles were loud, dirty, crowded, and dangerous. The kitchens burned constantly, filling the air with smoke. The great hall reeked of spilled ale, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Livestock wandered through courtyards. Raw sewage flowed in channels beneath the walls. Rats and disease thrived. The castle might have looked beautiful from the outside, but inside it was a noisy, chaotic machine powered by human suffering. Still, these workers, these forgotten craftsmen, changed the world, not through words or titles or wealth, but through stone and sweat. Some of them died before the fortress was complete. Some died long after, never knowing that the walls they built would outlast entire dynasties. The irony is painful. Kings built castles to prove their power, but the names written in history books are rarely the names of the men who actually built them. Their stories survived only in scars and legends and unfinished grave markers. But without them, the stone giants of the medieval world would never have existed. And when we look at these ruins today, cracked towers, broken battlements, staircases worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, we are seeing the fingerprints of ordinary people. People who woke every morning with aching joints, who lifted stones heavier than their own bodies, who prayed for safety and often never found it. Workers who shaped Europe not with pen or sword, but with calloused hands and backs bent beneath impossible weight. Imagine them now, a mason standing on the highest scaffold, wind tearing at his cloak, eyes stinging from dust as he carves the face of a battlement. He does not know that future generations will admire the craftsmanship. He only knows the foreman is shouting, the rope lift creaks dangerously, and one wrong step means death. Imagine the carpenter balancing on beams high above the courtyard, hammering supports into place. Imagine the blacksmith's workshop glowing red at midnight, sparks leaping like fireflies while he hammers steel into shapes that will outlive him. None of them could imagine you, centuries later, staring at their work and wondering how they built something so impossible. If they knew, maybe it would matter. Maybe the thousands of nameless men who worked until their bodies broke would be proud to know that people still ask how they did it. But history is strange. It writes books about kings and generals and queens. It rarely writes books about the workers who lifted every single stone, and yet the castle remains, silent, immovable, a monument to effort no one witnessed and suffering no one recorded. To this day, we stand in front of these ruins and admire the architecture, the engineering, the beauty. But we almost never imagine the human cost, the broken hands, the lost fingers, the crushed ribs, the bodies buried inside the walls because it was cheaper than giving them graves. Here is the hardest truth of all. The medieval world did not care about fairness, comfort, or mercy. Castles were not built on dreams. They were built on backs. They were not symbols of beauty. They were symbols of fear and control. And the men who built them never lived long enough to walk their halls as honored guests. But there is a kind of justice that time gives us. Today, when we visit these places, we don't stand in awe of the lord who commissioned the castle. We stand in awe of the workers who built it, the true masters of stone. The men who understood gravity, strength, pressure, tension, and balance without ever reading a book or owning a piece of parchment. They passed their knowledge through calloused hands from one generation to the next. Their skill was a gift, but it was also a prison. A son born to a mason was likely to die a mason. A boy who learned carpentry at 12 might spend his entire life splitting wood, shaping beams, and climbing scaffolds. The world did not offer choices, it offered survival. Still, something in them refused to give up. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was hunger, maybe it was the small hope that, one day, their children might live better than they did. Every stone they placed was a statement. We were here, we lived, we built. They could not write their names on parchment, so they wrote them in stone. Centuries later, when kings are forgotten and dynasties fade to dust, their work remains, the stones still stand, the walls still rise, and even without knowing their names, the world remembers them. Every mason, carpenter, blacksmith, quarryman, rope, puller, coal, burner, mortar mixer, water carrier, and young boy running barefoot across the scaffold. So the next time someone sees a castle and thinks of knights and crowns and royal feasts, let them remember this instead. The castle is not a monument to power. It is a monument to labor, to pain, to sacrifice, to human endurance, and to thousands of ordinary people whose lives were harder than we could ever imagine. It was worse than history books say, worse than paintings show, worse than stories tell, but they did it anyway. And because they did, the world was changed forever.